Um,
Recording in progress.
yeah. So yeah, this is just experimental in that, like, the prompt for a lot of this is I realized that there were a lot of things I was explaining to people really well on coaching sessions that I had never actually written down. And some of this is because, like, a lot of things are just easier to explain verbally when I don't have to, like, try and organize everything. So I thought it would be interesting to just try and get a lot of stuff out of my head by explaining it to people. I'm going to try doing it as a sort of chalk and talk where I write in this Google Doc as I talk, but the Google Doc will be notes. I'm not actually very good at taking notes while I talk, so how well they stay in sync, we'll see. It's, as I say, ground rules up here. This is being recorded. It's going to go on YouTube. Everything else is sort of obvious. But yeah. Any questions before I get started? Cool. Yeah, so basically the thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is something I've sort of used in a bunch of explainers and it sort of appears implicitly, is the thing I call social triage, which another way of looking at this is everything I learned about social interaction I learned from conducting interviews. That isn't actually true, but a lot of it is true. And in particular, interviews are really interesting, and they reveal and make explicit a lot of social dynamics I think are sort of present everywhere, and as a result, it's useful to talk about them. So, like, your basic model of an interview is a series of people come in. You have to make a hire or no hire decision on them, and this is sort of on the face of it easy, and then you sort of get into the details of it and you discover it's basically impossible. And I think one of the, yeah, actually, I'm already realizing that the chalk and talk plan is terrible. Yeah, I'm just going to speak, and I'm going to turn. Yes, I just saw your suggestion, Simon. I think what I'm in fact going to do is just going to immediately abandon this sharing problem and turn into video mode.
So I think the largest issue is the sound of a keyboard.
Yeah. Oh, this is interesting. It's normally good at filtering that out because it's supposed to be in high sound. But okay, never mind. I'm going to ignore the plan of the document because it was bad. I hope. Oh well, this was explicitly highlighted as an initial experiment, and we'll just do it this way. Yeah. So interviewing, your basic model of an interview is a bunch of people come in, hire, no hire, depending on how many people you're hiring for. Like, you may stop after the first hire, you may do a bunch of other things. And you've sort of got like the easy mode interview, which I think of as being like the McDonald's interviewing problem, which isn't entirely fair. We've just got another one joining. Hi, Sagar, or maybe I'm pronouncing your name. I'm sorry. We've already started slightly. I'm just explaining to people like how interviews work, and I'm being mean about McDonald's interviews.
That's fine. Hey, David. It's nice to actually meet you.
Yeah. So yeah, like, your basic model of a McDonald's interview is you have someone who's coming in, has no real need for prior skills in the area, and you just want someone who, like, will turn up and will do a decent job, and they probably can't screw up so badly that it really matters, and if they do, you'll just fire them and hire someone new.
This is fairly fair. As someone who used to work at McDonald's, I think this is a fair model. You said you were being slightly unfair. I think you're being fair.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. And so the thing about the McDonald's interview is basically like you interview people one at a time, largely uniformly, and when and when someone arrives and you're just like, sure, you seem like you can do the job, you hire them and you're done. And there's nothing very hard about this. You're not looking for top talent. You're not having to screen a huge number of candidates in order to find someone worth hiring. If they and so the interview process is relatively simple. One way this process gets slightly more complicated is when you're hiring for someone who's customer facing in some way, for example. Like if they're going to be at the till, you need to sort of say, can they communicate with a customer? Are they likely to punch a customer? Like they're like as soon as you have sort of a customer facing role, like there's more of a failure mode. And as a result, the question of like, do I hire the right person? Or sorry, no, there are two questions. You want to make sure you need to ask like, am I hiring the right person? But also, am I not hiring the wrong person? And these are like subtly different questions. Like you cannot hire someone from McDonald's who is so good that it will make a huge difference, but you can sure hire someone from McDonald's who is bad enough that they can screw things up badly for you. So now you've got a risk, but not a huge amount of reward. And so the problem becomes a little harder, but still fundamentally, like most people you hire are not going to be too bad. And this is sort of like your level one interviewing problem. You're trying to sort of satisfy a requirement, but the base rate of like people who will satisfy your requirements is not that hard. And this is fine, but the problem you have is that like once you start making your requirements tighter and tighter, interviews stop looking like this. Like hiring for a tech interview versus McDonald's. The problem is that now your bar for success is much harder to clear, and the range of variation is much higher. And so what you get down to is something like, even as few like if 10% of people who apply to your tech job are a good fit for the role you're hiring for, you're doing pretty well at the hiring pipeline thing. But you have this sort of tension where you really don't want to hire the wrong people because this is now super expensive, and also more people are the wrong people. And as you increase the difficulty of your interview process, like the cost per interview goes up, and the number of people you have to interview before you get to someone who you want to hire also goes up. So you've got this like highly nonlinear function of essentially risks and rewards to cost of interviewing. And as some, like if you've been like the one doing interviewing, you know that like this is expensive, and B, it makes people doing it miserable. And one of the we've got more people joining as we go. I'm just going to carry on, and hopefully you can all sync up based on what I'm talking about. And yeah, so this is sort of like the core problem that one has to deal with in designing an interview pipeline is the way the costs grow really rapidly, the harder your interviewing process criteria are. Is this all making sense to people? Cool. So what you end up doing when you have these very expensive interviewing pipelines, for people who are just joined, who are wondering why I'm talking about interviewing, I promise this will all become more broadly relevant to people who are not conducting interviews very soon. Yeah, so what you do with these interview processes is that you try to arrange it so that per candidate, the amount of effort you spend on them is roughly proportional to like how likely they are to be worth the effort. You, for example, if you're hiring for a really senior role and you look at their CV and they're just like, okay, so this person hasn't actually programmed before, then you don't do the full like multi-hour interview with them. You just say, I'm really sorry, but your application has not been successful, or probably just like don't even reply and just ignore the CV entirely. And so that's like a level 1 screen. And here you've maybe cut out like half the work if half the candidates just clearly fail the CV screen. But there's an important thing here, like your CV, the CV screen is not intended to be particularly good. You can't, on the basis of a CV screen, determine whether someone is actually going to pass the interview, but you can, on the basis of a CV screen, determine if someone is clearly going to fail the interview. And so here what you're doing is you are, so there's a 2 error rate problem here basically at any point, which is like you can reject someone unfairly, or you can accept someone, you can accept someone who you really shouldn't have. And the consequences of these different error rates are wildly different between the CV screen and the full-blown interview. Because with a full-blown interview, if you, particularly with like a high-stakes sensitive job, hiring someone who you really shouldn't have can be a disaster. But passing someone through your CV screen to the next stage, it's kind of fine. It's like you have to, the bad thing that happens is that you have to conduct an interview. And so CV screens are sort of constructed as like, look for a red flag and reject anyone who flags up as red. And so this gives you sort of some reduction of effort, but like often what happens is you then discover that no, interviewing is still too expensive. And so you insert like a phone screen in between the CV. Like you, if someone passes the CV screen, you have a half-hour phone call with them in which you have a chat. And if they insult your mother in the course of the chat, you're just like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be working with you. But it's this general, and like sometimes you layer it. Like sometimes then when they come in for the in-person interview, you very carefully don't tell them how many stages the in-person interview is, so that you can quietly say no. So I've made this mistake where I've told someone it was a 3-stage interview, and after stage 1, I was just like, God, it's really not worth putting you through the other 2 stages. And so it's this sort of thing. It's you design your interviews, your interview pipeline with a series of early exits, where at each point, the primary purpose of the current stage is to decide whether it is worth going on to the next stage. And only the final stage is in some sense real. It's the point at which you are making the hire, no hire decision. And even that stage isn't 100% real, right? It's like once you made a hire decision, what happens is they enter a probationary period, which you can think of as like a 3-month-long interview. So this is what I mean by essentially like a triage model, is that at each stage, what you're doing is you are sorting people into like the people who can obviously go home versus the people who need more specialist attention. And to a large extent, all like hard interview processes are structured this way, although with varying numbers of layers, depending on how important it is that you get the right candidate versus how many candidates you have and versus other things. Is that all making sense to people? Any questions? So there are a whole bunch of sort of interesting dynamics that end up happening in it here that I've sort of written about in the past, but it's sort of one of the things that's worth highlighting about this is the feedback on, I've got a longer article that I'll link to later / in the comments on the YouTube video about the ethics of this. But basically one of the big problems here is that at any given stage, you only really get feedback on the people you have let through to the next stage. It's anyone who you reject from your interview process, you don't actually know whether you should have rejected them or not. Anyone who you let through your interview process and hire, you get a lot of feedback on whether you should reject them or whether you should have rejected them or not. And hopefully the feedback is good in the sense that like you're like, yes, it was great that we hired them, but the result is that based purely on the feedback you get from your hiring process, these interview processes tend to get narrower over time and also tend to select heavily for the sort of people who you know how to get positive signals about. My go-to example of this in tech is hiring based on open source contributions. Is like it's a thing that works very well for the sort of demographic who makes lots of open source contributions, and looks very good if you just look at the sort of false positive rates, but doesn't let you take into account who's being excluded by that. And so there's all sorts of like complicated questions about like how you design these processes and how you try and push back against narrowing over time. I'm not planning to go into any of those right now because that's sort of besides the point of what I want to talk about today, but it's just worth highlighting like there is a big ethical component to this as well. And sort of the core feature of these triage models is what you're always doing at any point you're spending effort is you're spending effort to decide whether it's worth continuing to spend effort. And my mental model is that everyone is effectively interviewing everyone else all of the time. It's every interaction is a sort of, I mean, that's not entirely true. Like you have essentially like neutral interactions, but by and large, most interactions are a form of deciding whether to continue interacting with this person and deciding whether to escalate the interaction with this person. So a trivial example of this is that you meet someone at a party, you have a 5-minute conversation with them, and the 5-minute conversation is deathly boring. And this person may actually be great. It's entirely possible that they're having a bad day, they're having, or they're socially anxious because they're in a party and they're an introvert, or any one of dozens of other reasons. But all you know about them is the 5-minute conversation you've just had in which you didn't talk about anything more interesting than the weather. And that's basically like the social equivalent of failing the CV screen. It's you don't know that they are actually boring. You don't know anything about them other than those 5 minutes. But there's 50 other people at this party, and what they've currently done is demonstrated that it's probably worth your while to go talk to somebody else. And so this is sort of why a lot of first impression-y things matter. Another good example of this is why I advocate very strongly for just essentially like if someone is a dick to you on Twitter, you block them. A stranger that is, like not necessarily someone you know, but but basically, like if someone comes at you and is particularly rude, like they may be absolutely fine. They may have legitimately misunderstood your point in a way that made you seem like the asshole in this interaction. They may you may have misunderstood their point in a way that makes it sound much worse than it actually is. All of these things are possible, and 99% of the time, no, they are just a dick and they're not worth the interaction. And they are, importantly, they are interchangeable with any other, like one of those, like 100 people. If you have 100 people who are being a dick to you on Twitter and one of them is fine, you have no way of knowing who that one person is without doing the work of distinguishing them from the other 100 people. And so you kind of have to treat them uniformly. And as a result, you have the same position as the interviewer who has to deal with 100 candidates, only one of whom is actually good, which is that you want to like lower your initial screen and basically say, thank you for trying to interact with me on Twitter, but your application has not been successful, blog. And yeah, so essentially, like your initial interactions with someone are effectively an interview stage to get to like the acquaintance stage of relationship. And you're probably, in the boring conversation case, you're not going to go quite as far as extreme as to essentially like give them the cold shoulder forever. You're just going to go, I'm going to go interact with someone else. But if you, I don't know, if they start spouting racist conspiracy theories at you in the first 5 minutes, then you probably are going to give them the cold shoulder. It's possible to fail the initial screen so badly that no further interactions occur for her, but that's usually not the case.
So this is kind of an interesting difference to interviews, right? You can fail it worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. It's but I think the same is true with interviews. Actually, I think it's harder to fail it worse, but
fair. Yeah, I see this.
Yeah, it's I think there are definitely people who I have failed at an interview where I'm basically like the easy version of this, right? Is someone can fail because they're basically fine, but they're not quite as good as another candidate, or they can fail because they're inadequately experienced. And I'm just like, look, you seem like a great person. I would love to work with you, but you're not right for this role. And so there's a lot of like ways you can fail an interview where this is not no forever. This is just no for this particular application. And there are ways you can fail the interview. Like the spouting racist conspiracy theories thing will also fail you an interview so hard you will never be invited back. But no, it is true. It is there's more of a range of responses with social, sort of casual social interactions than there is with interviews. I think often because it's lower cost. It's like the McDonald's example is closer to the social interaction example. Like it's really hard to fail a McDonald's interview, so hard that you can't ever apply to McDonald's again, right? I'm sure it's possible, but yeah. So that's sort of like the initial screen from like stranger to acquaintance, but there's also essentially like further interactions where, I don't know, you've met someone at a party, or there's like, hey, you seem cool, let's hang out. That's you making essentially the social equivalent of a job application to them. And maybe you failed your implicit CV screen and didn't realize it. More likely, like you hang out one time, and that's essentially like, because you have demonstrated in the course of your initial interactions that like trying to escalate the interactions to another level is worth doing. And this can either succeed or fail, essentially. and also, like, importantly, you can't always skip steps. Like, if you're a small child, you can pretty much run up to someone and say, hey, let's be friends. And that works surprisingly well if you're a small child. I know lots of adults who would love to be able to do this, and like to some degree, I'm one of them. But like, it's actually very high cost to be able to do this, and this is why we have these intervening triage models of like, okay, we hang out a bit. That seems to be going well. Let's sort of hang out some more, and each stage of escalation of the relationship, lowercase r, potentially uppercase r, but that's another thing, involves trying things out and sort of like gradually expending effort to try something outside of the current comfort zone in order to sort of find out what's possible, whether you want to continue to a new stage of that. And yeah, so a lot of things follow this basic model. It's like, if you look at sort of your classic relationship escalator dating stuff, this is very much an example of people doing this model, of like expending efforts to maintain the relationship at the current level and sort of gradually expanding it, and either essentially saying backing and either expanding it or failing to expand it. You can also go in both directions, right? It's to continue the jobs analogy, like you can be fired as well as hired. And so it's like someone could be sort of have made it through the various sort of levels of triage. So they're now like someone who hang out on a regular basis, and they sort of quietly confide to you at some point that actually they do think Jews did 9/11 or whatever. And it's, probably you're going to spend some effort to sort of say, okay, was this a joke? Was this something that you like? Why do you think this? It's like, if they were someone who was doing this on like your first hangout outside of having met at a party, it would basically be like, okay, bye. If they were someone who you had known for years and was a friend, you're just like, okay, so tell me why you think this. I would like to understand where you're coming from, and hopefully persuade you that you're wrong, maybe. So like, there's they're at a stage where like the level of investment they warrant is worth that. But depending on how you handle these things, I think instantly it's perfectly legitimate to try and maintain that friendship and as like a lifeline to try and give them a way out. But I think it's also perfectly legitimate for people to essentially go, nope, bye. But either way, this is sort of the level of effort you have already put into that relationship is part of what determines essentially the level of effort you put into deciding whether to end, de-escalate, whatever, or on the relationship. And relationships can go down as well as up. How is this all sounding so far?
That seems good.
Cool. And so I think this example of like hiring or firing is interesting because like I deliberately picked an example where it's relatively, I mean, based on the opinions based on those of you whose opinions I know, we probably all would sort of make that a clearer yikes. Let's maybe de-escalate. But in general, like a lot of our what was actually happening there in that case was that this person had decided to trust you with something that to them was kind of private, and was essentially seeing whether you were trustworthy in this regard. And the answer is that you're not, and that's good in this case. But like, if instead they had been sort of quietly coming out to you as saying, by the way, just so you know, I'm actually gay, or if they had said, I'm currently dealing with a lot of bad things in my life, or any one of a number of other things, where they're essentially saying, here is part of me. I'm displaying it to you essentially to find out if that's something that I can bring to this relationship. And this too is a bid to escalate the relationship in a sort of essentially a more trusted direction. And whether that works or not is partly about you in the relationship and partly about essentially trying to find some sort of compatibility. And so I think like this is one of the most interesting aspects of relationship building, is essentially like trying to discover the version of yourself that you can be in the relationship. And it comes very much with these bids for escalating trust on a particular subject. It's very much, here's a thing I want to be able to bring to the relationship. And largely it has to be something polarizing. It has to be something where where either the relationship will go up or down, because essentially because if it were something that would make the relationship reliably go up, it probably has just happened automatically already. These things tend to happen once the relationship it's true. No, maybe this. I was going to say this tends to happen once the relationship is relatively stable, but they don't have to be. But the point is that like most things that deepen the relationship are to some degree risky, and that they might not work, and they are these kinds of bids for trust. And you often see these happening after someone has essentially cleared the cleared a lot of the initial levels, is like a reasonably good acquaintance. You're having fun, and they're just like, okay, so this is fun. But like, what sort of relationship is this going to be now that we've established it's a valued one at all? A classic example of this that comes up a lot is essentially people who seem like really chill and laid back and are a lot of fun to be around, and then you discover actually they're super depressed. And this is sort of like the comedian problem, basically, of comedians are lots of fun to be around, but a lot of this comes from a relatively dark place. And what's happened is that you've got to the point in the relationship where they're just like, okay, let's see if I can trust this person to stop masking around them. And most people want to spend a lot of effort before they're willing to on the relationship before they're going to do that. I often think this is a mistake, because if you look at the hiring pipeline thing, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce the sort of the total cost of hiring a good candidate, right? And so what you're looking to do is you are looking to very early on discard anyone who is going to like fail your necessary good candidate tests. Like in the client-facing example, it's just like you don't want anyone who is going to punch a customer, for example. So you want to sort of find out fairly early on whether this is likely to happen. And so I think like what happens. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. This is the problem with not having planned out any of this in advance. Yeah, so what happens with a lot of this sort of trust advancement is that you are doing the sort of the moral equivalent of going through all of the effort of finding out if this person is a good candidate, and only then looking for anything that would disqualify them. Sorry, distracted by a question from Andy. That's
sorry, you don't have to answer like immediately.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, I'll answer that in a little bit. It's an interesting question. Yeah, so what happens is you spend all this effort on determining whether they're a good candidate, and then you only then you determine whether they're an acceptable candidate. Because I've actually, in fact, encountered this on like an interviewing example of someone I talked to, of essentially finding someone who is an absolutely great candidate, look clearly the perfect person for the job, until we discovered that maybe we shouldn't be bringing in someone with like prior criminal convictions of cybercrime on something that involved quite sensitive government data. And that's a slight editorialization of what happened, but it was basically this. And we were just like, yeah, sorry. And so this is exactly the sort of thing. Like if you have that sort of instant disqualification, then you want to front load it into the hiring pipeline. You want to say basically, it doesn't really matter how good you are, this isn't going to work out. And so a lot of these kind of polarizing things where you reveal aspects of yourself to people and they're just like, nope, I'm out, are better front loaded than after you've sort of invested a lot of effort into the relationship. But this, of course, has all sorts of problems as well. It's like sometimes it's a safety problem. Sometimes it's, but I think a lot of the time it's the safety in question is actually like much more emotional. It's like it feels bad to be rejected, so you are trying to wait until they are less likely to reject you. And like they're legitimately less likely to reject you because it's exactly this triage process. It's if someone if this triage process is because of like how much effort they're willing to spend. If someone sort of you meet in the first 5 minutes of a party and they sort of start trauma dumping at you, you're just like, okay, that's a lot. You seem like you're having a bad time, but this isn't my problem, which is harsh, but also what people do. And so there is this like effort trade-off that happens where what you want to do is get the relationship to a point where like they will give you the energy to engage with the thing you're talking about, but but I think people err too far on the side of safety and end up with like putting these much later in the process. It's the problem of being stuck in small talk mode for far too long. And as a result, never, when really like, you can't necessarily drop straight into deep talk, like sometimes people do, and actually sometimes that works really well. But if you delay important subjects too long, you end up essentially, like the risk actually goes up rather than down, because the risk is both like the probability of it going wrong and also the cost of it going wrong, which includes all of the effort you've invested in the relationship so far. This is a big digression, which, no, I mean, this is still important actually, because the thing that you're doing in making a bid for trust is you are essentially trying to expand the regions of interactions you're having with someone. Or regions of possible interactions. It's if you think of trust, so the notion of trust that I really like comes from the philosopher Thi Huen. I almost certainly am pronouncing his name wrong, but he's got trust as an unquestioning attitude, which is essentially like the things that you trust are the things you can just assume are true. It's if I talk to a close friend about something innocuous, I trust they're not going to just start randomly shouting at me about it. But like if I've had conversations with you about some particular topic beforehand that I know can be sensitive in the broader population, I can trust that we can have a conversation about this. And in general, like trust is sort of the trusted region with someone is the things that are well trodden enough that you can actually have a proper conversation in that region. Whereas everything else, everything as you sort of move out of that region, you have to be like constantly doing these sort of cautious. Oh, but I don't mean this. I know it sounds bad when I say this, or like how are you with the subject of vaccines? Like will you suddenly start shouting at me if I tell you that I got my kids vaccinated? That sort of thing. I don't have kids. That's a hypothetical example. And what you're doing with each of these like bids for trust is you are simultaneously engaging in one of these like, is it worth spending effort in this direction? And most of them are going to be less difficult than the examples I've had. Like if I start talking about mathematics to a friend and they're just like, oh, I hated mathematics in school. It's not, I'm just gonna like, okay, fine. I just want to talk to you about mathematics in future. That's fine. So like, it's not like every bid for trust is not a relationship breaking thing necessarily, but it's a bids to extend versus like not worth carrying more energy in that direction. And so this is where the sort of the trust in interviewing or social triage intersection happens. It's like every conversation is implicitly an interview about like what sort of conversations we can have. And one of the reasons, one of my sort of vague talking points is that I'm a huge fan of people having conversations about how to have conversations with each other. And one of the reasons for that is like it is the easiest way to expand the zone of acceptable conversation. But it's not actually any safer than trying to just expand the conversation by talking about the thing. It gives you more reliable footing if it works. It's saying, how can we have conversations about vaccines is not easier than, or is not less risky than saying, so vaccines, here's what I think about them, because it inevitably is on that topic, but like it also, it expands the region further if it works, basically. It's a bit less risky, actually, because it does give you more opportunities to agree to disagree if it's a subject that you're able to do that on. And yeah, so these are sort of like my two interacting models of a lot of mechanics. It's the expending effort to decide how much more effort it's worth it to expend, which can be both like, is it worth spending more time with this person? And also, is it worth spending more energy per unit time with this person? Like an example of the difference is this person worth inviting to a party versus is this person worth having intense one-on-one conversations with? Like you can be worth spending arbitrary amounts of time at parties with, but not worth like being a deeper friendship. And this trust model of having like an implicit, like shared understanding of like the sort of conversations we can have and the sort of interactions we can have beyond that. So the question, the question from Andy, which I thought was interesting, was, how traumatic / type 2 or 3 fun brings people closer, and how does that factor into revealing more about yourself? I have no idea what type 3 fun is. Type 2 fun is fun that is only fun in retrospect. Like you're climbing a mountain and you're going, and all the time you're going, oh my God, this is awful, I hate it. And then you get down the mountain and you're just like, that was amazing, I want to do it again. I think type 2 fun is stuff that is more like satisfying and potentially exhilarating, but not necessarily enjoyable in the moment. So I don't know that this sort of fun reveals a lot about yourself necessarily. I think often what it does is it reveals certain traits of your character. Like what if you do something like hard and high risk with someone, you have a good idea of how reliable they are. You have a good you have some good notions of them. But I think what's actually going on here is probably much more about investment in the shared relationship. It's not that you now know their high trust secrets. It's that you've got a lot going on there. Like you have done the hard, scary thing together, and that has built a foundation for your relationship. That means if someone says something to you that you're just like, oh, I'm not sure about that, you're willing to, because of that investment and because of that past loyalty, you're willing to spend more time trying to come to a shared understanding, see if they're actually reasonable, see if there's actually, it's actually sort of worth taking the time to understand their perspective, where for someone who you had essentially just gone to the movies or whatever in the same timeline, like there's no shared investment there. You haven't deepened the relationship through a shared context in a way that justifies further effort. That's just my off the cuff theorizing, though. I haven't actually thought about this problem very much.
Okay, I was wondering, you talked about like people making bids of trust towards each other, and whether or not they're like received well. You decide whether or not to continue with the relationship. I know this is like multidimensional. Like you talked about the math thing, but like your life probably isn't all math. So if they don't like math, you can just be like, oh, I'm going to talk about like I don't know, like sports or something, and you can have a deep relationship in that subject, right? My question is like, what do you mean by like in what situation do you mean trust?
So just to be clear, like a failed bid doesn't necessarily end the relationship. Like a sufficiently bad failed bid might end the relationship, but like it's what a failed bid does is it fails to expand the relationship in that direction. And so what I mean by trust in these contexts is something like, I don't have to think about whether this is an okay conversation to have. I don't have to think about whether we can interact in this way. It is essentially it's the set of things you can sort of fluidly do with this person without worrying about it, without which is just sort of like an organic part of the relationship. And it particularly like looks like trust in cases where you are feeling vulnerable and you can sort of, and like if you're a gay person who is having relationship trouble for some reason, and you want to talk about it. I mean, this is true even if you're not gay. It's just like I was using the gay example earlier. Like if you want to talk about your sort of relationship problems, which you're currently feeling hurt and vulnerable about, and you go to a friend who you don't really know how to talk about relationships with, then you're going to be on guard, because there's always the possibility like they're going to be blunt and say something stupid, and then you're going to hurt more as a result. While someone who you've talked a lot about, you know that they're not going to hurt your feelings with things. You're not going to, like, having vulnerable relationship conversations is in your trusted zone with that person, and so is already part of the relationship. It doesn't require a bid to enter into that zone, or at least you believe it does not. Like one of the problems that very much occurs in this space is that you can be incorrect about like you can be incorrect in trusting someone about a particular thing. You can be you can have differing understandings of where the boundary of the trusted zone is, but like this is sort of the internal experience is like you believe that this is safe and will be very unpleasantly surprised if it turns out not to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense about the like how it underlies the relationship. But I was wondering what you wanted it to do, or like what are you like what are you thinking about? I missed the first part of this, so sorry if you already said this already. But like what are you trying to use this for? Or like, do you just use this like in your head?
So generally, it's a good question. So what I use this for a lot of the time is looking at social dynamics and basically asking what's going on here, which is a thing I do a lot. Because if someone is so the first part of this, which I think you weren't here for, was essentially me talking about interviewing a lot, and essentially how decision-making processes to let people into a job work, and how this is sort of analogous elsewhere. And so one example of this is of where I'd use this for is I know someone who essentially has a problem of like lots of friendships, but not many close friendships. And the reason for this seems to be essentially escalating, or the friendships plateau at a certain point, and never sort of expand the trusted region into the sort of having the sort of interactions and conversations that they want. And I suggested that some of this might be due to the lack of polarizing early, essentially, like trying to deepen the relationship before a lot of energy has been sunk into it, because that sort of essentially filters out for people who you can have those close relationships with, rather than building lots of weaker friendships. So it's mostly a tool of understanding, but it's a tool of understanding that I use for a lot of like trying to look at social situations and basically go, okay, how can we do this better? Where better very much includes like ethical treatment of the people involved. It's not intended to be manipulative. It's just that you inevitably sound manipulative as soon as you start talking about the social dynamics in calculating terms. But yeah, it's relationship advice is another example of this. I think a lot of people run into problems where they've expanded the relationship in terms of like its social signifiers without necessarily having expanded the trusted zone enough to actually support the relationship they want. And so you end up with a lot of these sort of long-term relationships where people have like all these things going on in their head where they can no longer risk making the bid because they are afraid it will break an important relationship. So it's another example of like a practical problem that is downstream of this sort of dynamic.
Okay, so it's like a way of thinking about relationships, yes, exactly. And like what underlies them. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, what underlies them, and also how they evolve and change, and often how they fail to evolve and change.
Do you think it's all trust, or do you think there's like trust is like one lens of looking at it, but there's like a different one?
I think that it certainly is not all trust. I think trust is foundational, but like trust is not a sufficient basis for love, for example. I think possible, arguably necessary, certainly not sufficient. So I think, yeah, I wouldn't want to even try to enumerate all the things that go into a relationship off the top of my head, but no, it's absolutely not all trust. But I think that these thinking in terms of level of investment and trusted regions is usually a pretty good starting point for thinking about relationship dynamics, but it's only a starting point. We've hit about an hour, so I'm sort of going to be winding us down over like the next 5-10 minutes, but I'm happy to just turn this into general questions and discussion at this point. People have thoughts. Is this making sense? Where is this on like a level of this was all obvious, David? Why are you explaining this to us? To wow, you have blown my mind.
Yeah, I think I would not have thought to frame this so explicitly. I guess something that occurs to me is like, how do you know it's worth stopping and saying, let me think about the trust elements at play? Like, I certainly don't do this automatically, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you know when it's a good idea, perhaps, to introduce this frame?
I think one way that you know that there is some interesting trust angle here is when you're getting a lot of anxiety in the relationship. Because often, anxiety is roughly discomfort with uncertainty. And if you have actions that you want to perform and you are avoiding because you don't know how they will be received, that is essentially like what you are saying, what you're experiencing is that your desired actions go outside the trusted zone. And often those will be entirely like, and often they go outside the trusted zone, they're entirely fine. But the fact that you don't know that they're fine is sort of the indication that you're at the trust boundary. And I think, yeah, often, again, I would like to expand the relationship in some way, but I don't know if I can, is again, like, again, a trust boundary a issue. Like you don't know where you want the relationship to be is within the region where the relationship can be, which may be trust or it may be something else actually. But I think anxiety is probably more of a sign than where you want the relationship to be, because anxiety tends to be about not knowing what's okay in the relationship.
I think that's quite useful also, because definitely a big part of me managing anxiety is learning when to treat it as a useful signal rather than a not useful signal. So this sort of links in interestingly with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any thoughts, questions? Okay, so here's a question. I thought this was useful for me to do. I'm definitely thinking of doing more of them. Would you be up for coming to more of these? Like, was it interesting enough to want to repeat?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, great.
Perhaps. it may help to have slightly more structure. I don't think it has to be rigidly structured. But yeah, I think an outcome of the experiment is that maybe a little more clear direct, just a touch more clear direction is a good idea, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think
but I would absolutely come to more regardless.
I think I was planning, like I said, I was planning at the beginning to use a chalk and talk system where essentially I wrote out on the in the document, but I think would have helped structure it and just immediately abandon that as a bad idea. I will definitely try and structure them a little bit more in future, but one of the reasons for doing this is essentially it's me trying to talk through things that I haven't yet figured out how to structure. So like the amount of I can structure in advance is somewhat limited sometimes, but yeah, no, I think I will. Yeah, I agree basically.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I like hearing you talk about this because it's not something you necessarily think about unless you're like in this space all the time. So it's interesting to hear like a formalization like of this idea, which is like how you talk to your friends and stuff, which is like what you do every day. But I did think that you like it felt like one of those things where if you don't prepare for a talk, you can make it last for like an hour. Like certain parts were like slightly redundant, and with some slight prior planning, I think you could have avoided some of that.
Yep, no, I absolutely could have. And this is largely meant as a space for me to try and get out thoughts that I haven't necessarily figured out how to do that prior planning for, as I was saying to Eleanor. So
very good, Kai.
So Kai has just said that I'm asking whether this talk has passed our interview screen for later ones, which yes, entirely correct. This is very much an example of what I'm talking about, that you are investing effort to find out if it's worth investing more effort. But yeah, I agree with all of the requests for more structure, that in that more structure would be good. I don't know whether more structure is achievable because to a large degree, this is the thing. The thing this enables is to give me a space to essentially talk about what's in my head as like a prep for more structuring later. So like these shouldn't be thought of as like equivalent to a formal lecture where I know what I'm saying in advance. This is much more, I was aiming for sort of more in the level of like what I would explain to someone in a conversation. But of course, it does end up with me just monologuing because of the nature of I pick a topic and then ramble about it. So I will try to be a little less rambly next time, but honestly, I can make no promises at all.
I think the ramblingness is fine. I think the chalk and talk is a good idea in the sense that it helps to follow what's going on. The question is, I guess, how to make something like that work.
Yeah,
that's
I mean, what I might do is I might try and put together some like really basic slides for next time, which are probably no more than, I don't know. We'll see. I'll have a think about it. And
out of curiosity, according to you, what made you decide quickly that the chalk and talk wasn't going to work? What was the trigger for that for you?
Oh, the trigger was that I was trying to write and talk at the same time.
Which is not going to work.
And immediately realized that this wasn't going to work, and that you were going to be sitting there or sort of listening to my keyboard tap and seeing words appearing on the screen, and that was going to be awkward for me and tedious for you.
As a mathematics tutor, I struggle. So I also struggle with this. So that makes sense.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll have to think about the format for next time. I will probably run another one of these next week. I think it won't be on Tuesday. I think it's more likely to be on Wednesday. And I will, by default, add everyone who had an email address in the calendar event to the next one. And feel free to come or not as you like. But thank you very much for coming to this one.
Thanks, David. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah,
everyone. Bye.
Evening / time zone.
Bye, David. This was fun. Thank
Bye.
you. See you next time.
See you next time, all. Take care.
Thank you.